All right, I've got 6 o'clock. Good evening. Good evening. We've got about half of us. I think I'm losing people by the week. That's okay. Miss Terry, would you mind opening us up in prayer, please, ma'am? Please.
Can I reach it? We're there. Father, thank you for the joy of gathering together with your family. Thank you for the time and effort that Lauren has put into this to bring your word alive for us. Father, just show us how to be your vessels and share your truth and your hope with others, that they'll come to be part of your family too. Just show us how to be your vessels. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. We're on the downhill slope at this point. So we're at session 7 of 10 and moving along in a pretty good click. I'm not going to do much of a recap of what we talked about last week. How did we feel about last week? We saw the genetics, eh? Yeah, we've got in the genetics what we're able to see now, or some interesting things. We'll recap just very, very briefly, and then we're going to move on. Tonight ought to be fun. We're going to put our thinking caps on and start looking at the 6,000-year clock, or at least some credible evidence that supports a 6,000-year clock. And then next week we'll get into deeper into the genetics, the technicals of the genetics. We'll try and keep it at a high level so it's understandable, but what we're doing is tracing human history through genetics. Hit that next slide for me. So again, tonight we're looking at the 6,000-year clock. Hit that next slide. What we talked about last week was that mitochondrial, that is the DNA that is passed down the maternal line from grandmother to mother to granddaughter. Phylogenetics is that stitching together the common ancestry that we have of people, is what you're familiar with Ancestry DNA, 23andMe. When we put the phylogenetic tree together, this is Dr. Jeanson, Nathaniel Jeanson's work up in Kentucky. He's a Harvard geneticist, Harvard trained, and he took this in, I believe it was October of 2015, out of the Human Genome Database. He put this together, that phylogenetic tree, and what we found was, there were 3 mothers. Good evening. There were 3 mothers that all of humanity, some 8 billion people that we have in the world today, 8 billion people go back to 3 mothers. Good morning, or evening, or what? It's morning in China. The mother at the top was Europe. The one down in the south is Asia. And what we found, not only do we have 3 mothers in the mitochondrial DNA of humanity worldwide, but also that red line we said was representative of the number of generations, which is roughly equivalent to the number of mutations or copying errors that we find in the mitochondrial DNA. So the most extreme ends, the difference between those 2 contemporaries, the European mother and the Asian mother, is indicative of creation, Adam and Eve, all the way to the flood in 1656 AM, which would be Anno Mundi. So that red line is 1,600 years. The aggregate, or the mean, of those yellow lines, which is just a handful of those black, if you take the average of those black lines, we said from the mother out to the very tips, on average, is about 2.6 times longer than that red one. That is representative, again, of the number of generations, the number of mutations that we find in the genetics. So the number of differences that we find in the genetics is 2.6 times longer than the mutations between Europe and Asia. That would be representative of Adam and Eve to the flood. That's 1,600 years from the flood, and then from 2400 BC to the modern day to today is about 4,400 years. That's also a 2.6 to 1 ratio. So what we can see in the genetic mutations of people worldwide happens to correspond with the biblical timeline that we have. We can also see in these mothers the Europe, the Asia, the Africa. Those are the directions that we find after the Tower of Babel in Genesis 10 and 11 in the Table of Nations. Hit the next slide. We can see the same thing in the Y chromosome. That is the paternal line that goes from grandfather to father down to grandson. We said that there were 3 of those fathers. You can see with those vertical dash lines, you've got Africa to the left, you've got Asia to the right, and you've got Europe somewhere in the middle. So the Y chromosome is telling us the same thing that we find in the mitochondrial DNA. And by the way, we went back to Genesis chapter 7, Noah's flood account. We said that Noah and his wife ceased having children. He was 600 years old when the flood waters came. And Genesis 9 and 19 says that from Ham, Shem, and Japheth and their wives, all the world's population came from them. That's exactly what we're seeing in the genetics. Hit the next slide. So, modern geneticists, as we said, are on a 200,000 year paradigm. They think human history started 200,000 years ago. They puzzle at the fact that we have what they call a genetic Eve that was some 200,000 years ago, and about a little over 100,000 years ago, we find the genetic Adam. So you've got a latest LCA, latest common ancestor on the female line, goes back 200,000 years. Least common ancestor on the males, about 110, 120,000 years. There's a big difference between the two of them. We'll talk about that probably next week. What Jeanson did is he took that 200,000 year paradigm and he compressed it down to a biblical timeline of 6,000 years. And what we find is that blue line we looked at really closely last week. He is taking the phylogenetic tree, he's finding those common ancestors, he's stitching it back together, and he is making assumptions and estimations. We said that the blue lines, there's dark blue on the left and right, those are ranges, represented by that lighter blue in the middle. These are the ranges that he thinks that we can see according to the phylogenetic tree about what populations would look like. Remember the populations in the Y chromosome, there are 3 mutations that occur each generation very consistently. And so what they're doing is they're making estimations by generation about how far back we're going in time. We're going to look at this really closely tonight. And so what he did when he took those estimations, he came up with that timeline. He took Colin McEverty. I didn't bring that book with me tonight. Colin McEverty and Robert Jones looked at the census data and population data, actual pieces of paper from China, from Aztecs, from Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Byzantines, the Romans. They took all these population data, compiled it, and they took estimates of what they think based on documentation, what the world populations would be like. That's what that black dotted line is. When we overlay the two, that's a 90+% match. That's just astounding. That's very credible evidence for a 6,000 year paradigm when you can overlay that with census data from the years of old. So I want you tonight to put your attention there at 2400 BC. Put your fingers up for a minute. All right, that's a memory pointer. I'm a computer guy. And you're pointing at 2400 BC. That's about the time of Noah's flood. We're going to come back. We need to remember that. Hit the next slide. All right, last week we looked at the family tree of Japheth, the Japhetic people. They went up through Turkey into Europe. We looked at the genealogies that we said were independent of the Toledotes in the Bible. Toledotes are those genealogies we find in Genesis 5 and 10. And they said that they came from a man named Sceth that was the son of Noah, N-O-A in some cases, N-O-A-H in other cases. That this guy washed ashore bearing it was an empty boat that he washed ashore on, and he was bearing a sheath of grain when he washed ashore. Very close. Different account, but every nation worldwide has a different flood account. The Anglo-Saxons said that Sheath was washed ashore in an empty boat bearing a sheath of corn. And then We looked at the Anglo-Saxon houses. There were 6 Anglo-Saxon houses, independent of each other, kept their genealogies for Europe, as well as the Danes and the Norwegians. They kept theirs. There were 8 royal houses that we looked at as just a small subset of African or of European genealogies, and they are all identical, all the way back up to Japheth and then to Noah. So tonight, let's look at Ham. This is a vegetative map of the continent of Africa. You'll see the Sahara Desert across the top. It's green, vegetative in the middle, and Kalahari Desert down in the southwest. And of course, across the Red Sea in the upper right corner, you can see Saudi Arabia. That's the Arabian Desert. So, get that next slide for me. When we look at Genesis 10, which is the table of nations, we have to remember shortly after Noah's flood account, we're about 3 or 4 generations after Noah's flood, and we have the Tower of Babel event, and nations begin to disperse. According to Genesis 10, that is the table of nations. Starting in verse 6, I'll just read it to you. The sons of Ham, the first son was Cush. That's Sudan. That's the yellow nation that you see there. The second son was Egypt. We all still call it Egypt. Put is there in orange. That's modern day Libya. And Canaan is there in pink at the very top. That's modern day Israel. It goes through these sons down to a grandson named Sheba. Remember the Queen of Sheba? That is modern day Yemen that you see in violet at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. The point is, what we're seeing is immediately after the Tower of Babel event, we have the confusion of languages according to Scripture, and they begin to move in fraternal directions. So the Hamites go down into the Middle East through Canaan, through modern-day Israel, and they begin to appear. The very first generations that began the dispersion began in this cluster that you see in the northwestern corner of Africa and parts of Saudi Arabia and the Levant that we have in Israel. We're now at about 2200 BC. All right, go to the next slide. According to the phylogenetic tree that Jeanson has put together, he begins looking at a particular haplogroup of the African people. E appears where Egypt is. Now, E just happens to be haplogroup E. It does not stand for Egypt. What they did is secular geneticists took all the people groups of worldwide, they assigned a haplogroup, a common ancestry to each one, and those people just happen to be E. They are the ancestors of A and B that you see going south of them. Did I put the river? I did not put the rivers up there. So what do we know about that part of the geography? We've got the Nile River going north and south, and people are going to start moving along these river valleys. Keep in mind, where was our memory pointer a little while ago? We're at 2400 BC was Noah's flood. We're 3 or 4 generations after becomes the Tower of Babel event. That's with Nimrod that we see in Genesis chapter 11. We're now probably in the vicinity of 2200 BC. And what he sees in the genetics, according to these ranges, is the very first peoples end up coming across that land bridge out of Canaan, out of modern-day Israel, and entering across that land bridge into Africa. They weren't coming out of Africa, as secular geneticists say today. They were coming down into Africa, and we can actually see that. These circles, by the way, the diameter of the circle is indicative of the population density that he finds in the genetic ranges. So there's a very well-established and very large population of E showing up. And then their ancestors, A and B, start heading down the Nile River below. So that is 2400 to 2000 BC. Go to the next slide. What we are at now is 1400 to 900 BC. We're right at the tail end, or the begin. Actually, we're right in the vicinity of King David and King Solomon at about 1060 to about 975, somewhere in there, BC. The arrows that you see coming off of E do not indicate the path. It's just saying that these are descendants of E. So if you notice where these are, these descendants end up over, if you look to the far west on that horizontal coastline, that's the Ivory Coast of Africa. And then we'll call this the west coast, the vertical one down there where A is, down at the extreme south part of the continent. So we've got the Ivory Coast is horizontal, the west coast is vertical. And then we've got a cluster of folks that are somewhere in Central Africa. I could have swore I put a river map in there. Was it? Can you go back a couple there? There you go. Okay. It was the one I was actually talking about the nations, and I overlooked the rivers. Look at where those rivers are. So, as we saw on the other slide there, E has A and B going down the Nile River, and then another slide there, we've got the Ivory Coast over at the far west part. These people are living and moving. I think it was Pete this morning said in Acts 15 and Acts 16, people are moving along on their feet. And the way that they move is along where you find these resources. So you've got fresh water out of the river. You've got animals that are coming to drink. So you've got food sources. As these cultures and villages begin to develop, you've got means of commerce where you've got boats can go up and down the river. People are settling because of the resources available along these river routes. So go ahead to the next two again. So that's why we're seeing these people starting to settle around 1000 BC, around the time of King David and King Solomon in Africa along these areas. Go to the next slide. Okay, we're at 700 to 400 BC, according to the phylogenetic tree that he was able to put together. We start to see E1B1A. We're going to focus on E1B1A. It's a very wide, very large circle. I said that the diameter of the circle is indicative of the population density. So we're at the end of the prophets in the Bible. So we've got Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel, Isaiah. They're all captive by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. We're about 480 to 500 years out from Christ in the first century. And what we have is this very large established population of E1B1A. That's the one that we're going to focus on. So from here, we're going to go forward about 1,500 years. And we find that we're in the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the Renaissance era. We're going from 1200 to the 1800s. Look at the size of these, the diameter of those circles. Something is going on. These people are moving in mass in very large populations. They're moving out of the Ivory Coast. They're moving off of the West Coast. They're moving through those river valleys in Central Africa, and they're moving to the East Coast. What do we know happened during that time period? Right around, what happened in 1492? Columbus sails the ocean blue, so we know that Columbus was dealing in African slaves at that point. Let's move it to about the 1500s. We've got Portuguese and Spanish ships that are coming along the west coast and the Ivory Coast of Africa. They are taking enslaved people in bondage, and they're beginning the transatlantic slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. It's stunning that we can actually see this in the genetics. So what we're seeing are families that are trying to get away from the conflict, and they're moving away. And they're moving away in big populations. They're moving fast in a very short period of time. That's why we see such large diameters. We're going to see these circles again in data format here in just a few minutes. Go to the next slide. So they're, again, moving along these river valleys. These are where fresh water is. They can get in boats. They can move along where game is plentiful. So they've got food resources, and they're moving their families fast. So go to the next slide. At the same time, We've got those Portuguese merchants and Spanish merchants that are loading up their ships. We have excruciatingly detailed accounts. We have ships manifest. You have to remember this is commerce. So the transatlantic slave database is where this data is being extracted from. We had 12 million Africans that are moving off of the Ivory Coast and mostly out of Angola. They're in western part of Africa. 12 million were placed in bondage, put on ships. 2 million, about 16%, died at sea. Half of them end up in South America, down in Brazil. Now, when we see Brazil having the carnival every year, what race of people do you find partying in the parades in Brazil? They're African descendants, right? The other half went up into the Caribbean. When you get off the cruise ship in Bahamas, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, if you go to Jamaica, the Haitian people, Dominican Republic, what race of people do we typically find greeting us on the shoreways there? They're African descendants that we find. So about 5.5 million went down to South America and Brazil. The remainder of them went up into the Caribbean. That small little finger in the northwest is 388,000 enslaved people that goes along the what would become the United States. So 388,000 enslaved people come to the North America. What we're doing here is we're tracing the genetics and we're setting up a test case for Jeanson's phylogenetic tree and his Y chromosome clock. And what we're looking at mostly is what we see in the data right now. So go to the next slide. According to the Transatlantic Slave Database, most of them came off of West Africa. That's that yellow line by a long shot. Most of them were coming off the west coast of Africa. That's Angola. When you look at African American men today, 388,000 enslaved people comes to the North American shores. I bet I left it at home. According to the Constitution, 1808 is when transatlantic slavery became outlawed. Before that, there was import tariffs and things on enslaved people as property. 388,000 prior to 1808. Today, there are 42 million African Americans in the United States today. If you take half of that, about 22 million African American men have the Y chromosome E1B1A. 88% of those 22 to 23 million African Americans, 88% are E1B1A. We can actually see them coming off the Ivory Coast. We can see them coming off of the West Coast, and we can see how they came through according to those ships' manifest. We know the name of the ship. We know the date that they left. They know who the captain was. We know how much they sold for when they got there. We have very meticulous record, thousands of them, that have been compiled in the Transatlantic Slave Database. So go to the next slide. I'm sorry. I was talking to it, and y'all didn't see it there. So that's what we're seeing in that finger to the north. We're seeing the E1B haplogroup that are showing up. So we see two things happening here in this shot. We see, the folks over in Africa that are getting their families out in large volume, moving off of the West Coast, moving off of the Ivory Coast of Africa, and they're getting out of Dodge. They're trying to get away from the conflict. And the other half, we see those red lines going over to the New World. And I just said we got 388,000 that lands in what would become the United States. 88% of African American men today, E1B1A. We can see a forced migration and conflict. We can see it in the genetics. That's stunning to me when I saw that. Okay, hit the next. So let's see if we can apply what we've learned just at a very high level, what we learned from the African American. What's African American got to do with creation, Noah's flood, and things like that? What we're trying to do is test Jeanson's Y chromosome genetic clock. We said from father to son to grandson, there are 3 chromosome differences, mutations that occur. That red line at the bottom has got a V at the far right. That is that range of the 1200s to the 1800s when transatlantic slavery was occurring. We're going to take that information we just learned and we're going to go back to about 721. Let's just call it 720 BC. We're about 150 years probably out from the last of the prophets. And what we find is something happens at that point. Can you go to the next slide? I hope I can read this. Okay. When we look at 2 Kings 17, we have an event in the Bible that is very similar to what we find in African slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. We have the Assyrians that are coming down out of Assyria, and they're taking the 10 northern tribes of Israel out of Samaria. It says, in the 20th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, began to reign in Samaria over Israel. When they talk about Israel here, they're talking about the northern kingdom of Israel. We had, after Solomon, we broke apart into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So he became the king of the northern tribes of Israel, and he reigned 9 years. Against him came Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria. Hoshea offered no tribute to the king. So basically what's happening, according to the accounts in 2 Kings 17, is they thought they became so powerful that they could resist Assyria. They began to set up align themselves with the pharaohs of Egypt, and they thought they could defend themselves. And so one year after year paying tribute to the king of Assyria, they decided we're not going to do it anymore. And so the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. The king of Assyria then invaded all the land and came to Samaria, and for 3 years he besieged it. We can see this also in 1 Chronicles. Talks about the same thing. We can also see this, by the way, in Assyrian records when we look at those records. So what we have is the king of Assyria is about to take all the northern tribes of Israel and take them out of Samaria and move them over somewhere else. And we can see where that somewhere else is there, starting in verse 6. In the 9th year of Hosea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria, and he carried the Israelites into Assyria, placed them in Halah, the Habor, the river Gozan, and the cities of Medes. If you remember the Medo-Persians, that's the modern-day Iran. That's the Persian Empire that eventually defeated Babylon. Something to realize, very similar to the transatlantic slave trade, they did not take all the Samaritans, they did not take all the northern tribe of Israel out. What they would normally do during an exile is they'll take the royal house and his family, the king and his family. They'll take the high officials that are in the government, the inner circle of the kingdom, and they'll take all the skilled craftsmen and they'll move them out and they'll move them somewhere else. And they'll leave the lion's share of the population, the unskilled labor, the sustenance farming, things like that will end up being left behind. And so what it says in 2 Kings 17 is the king of Assyria then took people from Babylon, people from other conquered nations to the east of Assyria, and he moved them into Samaria. And so now we've got pagan nations that are moving into Samaria in 2 Kings 17, and they're beginning to intermarry. And it actually says, I'll read it to you. I can find 2 Kings 17. It says, so the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you've carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of the land. So the God they're talking about is the God of Isaac, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore he has sent lions. God has sent lions among them, and behold, they're killing the people there because they do not know the law of the God of the land. And so the king of Assyria commanded, send one of the priests, one of the Levitical priests, whom you carried away from there. Let him go back, dwell there, and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel. You remember Bethel and Ai is where Abraham and Lot separated. And he taught them how they should fear the Lord. And when you go down to verse 32, it says, they feared the Lord and appointed from among themselves all sorts of people as priests of the high places, who sacrificed for them in the shrines of the high places. So they feared the Lord, but they also served God, their pagan gods, and after a manner of the nations from where they had come from. So here we see evidence of why, when we get to the first century, we got the parable. You talked about it this morning, as a matter of fact, the parable of the Good Samaritan. They did not like the Samaritans because they were a mix of Hebrew and pagan nations. That's why that the Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. And so what we see now is the royalty, the elite of the northern tribes of Israel have been pulled out. They're moving along the Habor, the Halah. They're moving along the Gozan River, and up into the cities of Medes, modern-day Iran. So go to the next slide. What we see there is this phylogenetic tree of the Y chromosome. We saw this earlier, where we've got the three fathers that we are trying to make the case with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there's a red box right in the center of that. We're going to zoom in on that. What we have is two haplogroups inside that box. We have T and we have L. Now, I think it was Richard last week was trying to make the case that because it's blue and doesn't have any branches, it must be people from Kentucky. And it's not. These are modern day men from Israel. So we're again looking at the Y chromosome of men, and T happens to be the people, the men that we find in modern day Israel. So if we go back to Moses, when he gives the law, he says when he gave that law to Jeremiah and to the nation of Israel, he said, when you go into the land, don't give your sons and daughters to the people, and don't take their sons and daughters for you. Keep your marriages within the nation of Israel, between the 12 tribes. So we know the last 2,000 years prior to Jews coming back into modern day Israel, they were in Poland, they were in Hungary, they were in Germany, they were scattered like sheep among all the nations of the world. And what did they do? Babylon is gone, Rome is gone, Byzantines are gone, the Assyrians are gone, Alexander the Great is all these major empires that they were in bondage, enslaved over. The Jews are still here. And all that time, they preserved their language, their culture. They still speak a flavor of Hebrew. They still can read. I think it's astounding that Jews today can go into the archives of, into these caves and dig out like Dead Sea Scrolls and whatnot, and they can unroll them and look at them and read them. That's amazing to me that they've been able to keep their language all of these centuries later. But that's what you're seeing in T. We're actually seeing Scripture unfold in the genetics. You always hear that Jewish lady from New York, oh, Harold, can't you just find a nice Jewish girl to marry? It's in their culture. That's what they do. It's their tradition that they would marry another Jewish person. And we can actually see that in the genetics. But go to the top of T, and you can see their genetic cousins is haplogroup L. We're going to make the case that is probably the 10 lost tribes of Israel that we saw in 2 Kings 17. In Jensen's book, he's got several footnotes. I'll read a couple of them to you. Haplogroup L might be the Edomites, which are, you remember, Abraham had Ishmael. Actually, the Edomites would have came from Esau, the brother of Jacob. These are the twins that they put the red ribbon around his. So he says they might be Edomites, the descendants of Esau, or they could possibly be the lost tribes of Israel. It says the same thing in the back somewhere here. There's a correlation that implies haplogroup L is a sister lineage of haplogroup T. It's also an Abrahamic in origin. It represents either the descendants of Esau, which would be Abraham's grandson, or it could be the lost 10 tribes of Israel. I'm going to try and make the case that this is, in fact, the lost tribes of Israel. Go to the next slide. We're going to take haplogroup T. Look at Jeanson's work. Jeanson took out of 3 genetic studies of the Y chromosome over an 11-year period of time, put together the phylogenetic tree, looked at where we have T and L. T are modern-day Israel, as I said. And then haplogroup L is in the Middle East. It's in South and Central Asia. Well, how'd they get there? Let's look at the data. Remember those circles that I were talking about on the map? Go ahead to the next slide for me. Those circles that were on the map, I said the population density was how we determine the population densities that we have. And he's basing this on the percentage of the haplogroup as a whole. So 96% of haplogroup L is represented in this particular chart. This is actually an Excel spreadsheet. You can see 45% are down in South Asia, some 32% almost are in Central Asia, and then the Near East, 19.5%. You can see where these populations, according to the data, the sampling that they took, we know where haplogroup L is today, the same way we know where all of our genetics are today. And these are the locations where you find. The highest concentration, by the way, is in South Asia. That's down in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, India, down in that region. Remember in 2 Kings 17, we began to lose track of them. They said they went across the Euphrates River into Halah, the river Gozan, the cities of Medes. They went up into the Hazor River. They went up into the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq and Iran, and we start to lose them. But what we find in the Assyrian records is the Hebrews that were there, they settled them along the eastern coast or the eastern border of the Assyrian Empire. And the Hebrews that were there began to complain to the Assyrians that you have made us a defensive wall against your enemies. So all the enemies that are east of the Assyrian Empire, modern-day Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, all the stands that we have out in the Middle East, those pagan people are trying to hit the Assyrians, and so they put the Hebrews along there, and they said, you've made us a defensive wall. We can actually see that in the Assyrian records. When we take this data and overlay it on a map, again, we're looking at 96% of haplogroup L and where we find them today. There's a small 5-6% that are other parts of the world in the modern day, but currently, today, as we speak, 96% are located in these places. So that's taking that Excel spreadsheet that we just looked at a moment ago and putting it on a map so that we can see where it's at. Good stuff, right? Hit the next slide. 2 Kings 17 again, it's talking about where they're moving. They're moving to Halah. You can see Halah over, I can't see it, maybe you can. Halah is there at the northwest corner. That top arrow is pointing at it. The cities of Medes that it talks about, you can see upper right corner. The river Gozan and the river Habor, we can see there at that bottom arrow. Let's hit the next slide for a moment. By the way, when we go back to Genesis chapter 10, it's talking about the Tower of Babel event. You go into Genesis chapter 11 as well. We've got Nimrod there. We can see Nimrod in this old drawing of a map. Nimrud, as they call it. Also Rezin. He was I'm going to turn around so I can read it. He was the first earth to be a mighty man. The beginning of his kingdom was in Babel. That's modern day Baghdad, Iraq, about an hour south of where we're looking right now. In the land of Shinar, that is where the Tower of Babel was built. We can actually see, and we saw a picture of it in session 2 of the base of where that would have been before Alexander the Great tore it down, about 300 BC. From that, the land, he went to Assyria. He built Nineveh, modern-day Mosul, Iraq, up there in the brown. Rehoboth, and Calah is in purple, just south of it. And Rezin, which is also Nimrod, is in between. And of course, we can see the 2 Kings 17 cities of the Hazor, Gozan, and and the other cities. So these are the places that we see out of the Bible, and now these topographical features bearing the names of these individuals along with the locations of where they went. I think we've got a slide coming up of Josephus talking about this. So go to the next slide. When we look at that map and we superimpose it over a broader map, this is kind of where it's at in Asia. So James, for these next two, if on this slide and the next one, I'm going to ask you here in a second if you could kind of go back and forth about 3 or 4 times. Focus on the rivers underneath the red and the green arrows. So the green to the far right is Babylon, that's modern-day Baghdad, and then Mosul and Nineveh is the red line, the end of the red line, all of it going back into Samaria and into Israel. So go ahead and jump back and forth. You'll start to see the river basins, the river valleys that they're going. Can you go back one? And forward. You see those river valleys? So we got bipedal people, as Pete said. They're walking on their feet. They're moving people en masse. They're moving these people out. They're moving along where the greatest resources are. They're moving them along the river, and eventually in Halah, Habor, the river Gozan, and up into the cities of the Medes. So go ahead and hit the next two. When we get to the 1st century, we are about 700 years after the exile of the 10 lost tribes. After 2 Kings 17, after 1 Chronicles, I believe it's in chapter 5, we completely lose track. Biblically, in the biblical narratives, we lose track of the 10 lost tribes. That's why they call them the 10 lost tribes today. But we do have extra biblical sources. This happens to be Josephus. There in the red, he's tracking 3 different groups of Hebrews. I'm using Hebrews and not Jews on purpose. I'll explain why in just a moment. Wherefore, there are 2 tribes in Asia and Europe. There's 2 groups there, Asia and Europe, that are subject to the Romans. And then there's another group. While the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude that cannot be numbered. There are so many of them you can't even number them. But he knows in the 1st century, 700 years after they've been taken, he knows where they went. According to Scripture, he knows where they went. And there is some evidence that there was some communication between Jerusalem and those people that are out there in the Middle East. So that is the text that we're looking at out of 2 Kings 17, 1 Chronicles, I believe it's chapter 5, as well as the genetics that we can track these people. I find that fascinating that we can trace these people and where they're going. And we're going to draw some conclusions here in just a moment. Go to the next slide. This is going to rock somebody. Go to the next slide. We're going to look at topographical features. I spent a lot of time in my career over in the Middle East, specifically dealing with Afghanistan and Pakistan. I worked at CENTCOM for 5 years, SOCOM for 2 years. That red box that you see there happens to be Kandahar. Anybody remember Kandahar during the Afghan war? So we had an air base in Kandahar. You'll notice that the region around there is very mountainous. It's very rugged. It's very, very mountainous. It's very difficult to move around. Airplanes, for whatever reason, seem to like to land on flat spots. And so in that green area, we have salt flats where we could have an air base there in Kandahar. So we're looking from about the southwest, looking generally toward the northeast at the Pak-Af border. That's what the black line is. You've got Afghanistan to the left, Pakistan to the right. We're going to move up into Afghanistan now and look south, or look east, I mean. So we're looking over into Pakistan. The Kandahar is still in that red box. We're going to keep our eye on that in that salt flat. As these Hebrew people would have been moving through the Middle East, we're going to start making this case. Dr. Avigdor Shakhan was a victim of Nazi Holocaust. After World War II, he heard about people that were out there. We're going to see some of his studies and research here in just a moment. But he found that there were people that had a tradition of being of the lost tribes of Israel. And if it were true, and if they came through here, they would have walked through this salt flat, because there's mountains all around, and now they're walking down this flat spot in the middle. Go to the next slide. When they approach Kandahar, Kandahar in Hebrew means now is a mountain, or there is a mountain. The actual Hebrew word for the beginning of a mountain range. They're walking across this salt flat, they're surrounded, and when they get to the very end, now is a mountain range. Up in the upper right corner this morning, I took a screenshot of Google Translate, just so you can kind of see what it says in Hebrew. Here, a mountain, you see Kanhar. The duh is actually Aramaic for this. So we actually have a topographical feature that just happens to bear a Hebrew name. Could be coinkydink, but I don't think so. Where, during the Afghan war, does anybody remember where Osama bin Laden was holed up in the Taliban? Remember the mountain complex where he was? Anybody remember the name? Do we remember Tora Bora? Go to the next slide. Tora Bora, you know what a Torah is? Tora Bora translates into God gave us the law, he gave us the law. Tora Bora is what that mountain complex is called. It's about 310 miles northeast of Kandahar. So we were loading up our planes with bombs, and we were shelling them pretty well up in Tora Bora. So now we've got two topographical features that bear Hebrew names. Go to the next slide. And I am definitely going to have to turn around for this one. So again, we've got that Pakistan border and that black line at the lower right. Pakistan is off to the right. We're seeing mostly Afghanistan in most of that. Tora Bora is in that yellow box. Kandahar is in that red box. And what we find is all along that Pakistan border, we have Hazaristan, Hazara Say, Day Hazara, South Hazaristan, Hazara Gaya Hazari. Hazara in Hebrew means the foreign land. This happens to be the exact location where Dr. Avigdor Shikhan happened to be when he was working, trying to find these modern day Muslims who had a tradition of being of the lost tribes of Israel. Go to the next slide for me. Let's look at those traditions. I might actually get through this. I thought I was going to be long tonight. The Pashtuns, what they also call the Panthin tribes. By the way, Pakistan, P-A-K-I. If you know what Stan is, you got Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, you've got Afghanistan, Pakistan, you've got all these stands out there. Stan means the land of or the country of. Pakistan, P-A-K-I, is the Pashtuns, the Afghans, the Kurds, and the Indians. That's where Pakistan gets its name. So the Pashtuns are a major tribe that you see there. They're the second largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. It was at 15, a little over 15% in Pakistan, sorry. In Afghanistan, they're almost half of the population, the largest ethnic group that they have. These Pashtuns are. Let's look at these Pashtuns. These are the ones that were of interest to Dr. Shikhan as he's moving about the Middle East. He's moving along that Pakistan border, and the tribes that he engaged with, as he hit these tribes by tribe, these people claim to be of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They have a family tradition of being of Reuben, of Ephraim, Gad, Levi, all of these tribes that in 2 Kings 17 have been removed out of Samaria by Shalmaneser in about 1710 BC. They still maintain, remember what Moses told them in the law, stay to yourselves, intermarry within yourselves. We're going to see why in just a moment, why they converted to Islam. Go to the next slide. So these are the cousins of T. Genetically, when we follow them back, we can see that they are of common ancestry. We can see that they're of common ancestry and that they are have a tradition Okay, Adam, thank you. Adam Sachitano is telling me they're watching online. They couldn't make it because they got the fall break. Thank you, Adam. I'm going to read some of these traditions that they have. I didn't think I'd get this far tonight. I'm glad I did. I'm going to take different sources. Some of these are Dr. Avigdor Shikhan. Some of these are others. Benjamin Matulela, I guess he was a rabbi in the 12th century. Benjamin recounts 2 Jewish men, which would actually be Hebrew, were held captive. Actually, these are Jewish men that were with him. He was a Jewish rabbi from the Iberian Peninsula, part of what is now Spain. So he was with 2 other Jewish men that were held captive for 6 months by brigands. These are highway robbers. Between Bukhara and Kabul. They were redeemed by nomadic, and he called them Jewish, they were redeemed by nomadic Hebrew tribes with a tradition of originating from the tribes of Babylon. In 1837, missionary John Wood traveled to Kabul, from Kabul to Bakla, and he described nomadic, he again calls them Jewish, they should be Hebrew, and he described nomadic Hebrew tribes and bands of brigands, again these are highway robbers, in the area of Bakla and Tashgora, according to his trip logs that he took. Thomas Holdrych, in his book Afghan Claim to Descend from Israel, this is in 1919, he traveled with a caravan throughout the Middle East there. They refer to themselves as Israelites and insist they are not from the tribe of Judah, which, if we know what happened in Samaria, in the 10 lost tribes, Judah was not one of them. There may have been some of the tribe of Benjamin and Judah among them, but generally they were not the tribes that were taken out of there. This is interesting. Yitzhak Ben Zivi, he's actually the predecessor to Benjamin Netanyahu. Back in the 1950s, he was the president of Israel. I see a head nodding over there. You remember this guy. The head of the group, he's talking about, he interviewed some of these tribes, and he was talking to a tribal elder. He said the head of the group had black fringes. They asked him why he had fringes and why they were black. And he replied that they were Israelites. He added that his mother lights Sabbath candles and places them in a corner under a basket. We see this in Scripture. And they live as a family by themselves. And ever since the temple was destroyed, they wear black fringe, at least until they return to Jerusalem. There are a lot of accounts of these Muslim people in the Middle East that claim to be the lost tribes of Israel that are looking forward to the day that they will come back to Israel. Why they don't just go ahead and do it, I don't know. Seems that they could. But they all have this tradition that they're looking forward to the day that they can go back to Israel. Reuven Kashani says that we know that our origins are Israelite. That was handed down to us from one generation to the next. Until the Muslim conquest, we were fully Israelite. We have a tradition that almost 100 years before the Muslims arrived in the area, the women of the pagan tribes attacked us. They got beat by a girl. The women came from the pagan tribes and attacked them and carried everything they could, including their ancient books. And when the Muslims finally came, and our fathers heard that they too believed in one God, they agreed to convert to Islam to be saved from annihilation, but secretly they continued to maintain the tradition of their Jewish origin. If you know anything about Islam and Sharia law, you basically got 3 choices. You can die, you can tithe, you can pay, or you can convert. You can pay tribute, a tax basically, or you can convert to Islam. But those are your 3 choices. And so rather than suffer annihilation, they converted. There is a city, Jalandhar, between New Delhi, this is getting down towards India, and Ahmedabad. This tribe is about 5,000 people. See if this sounds familiar to you. This is a tribe of about 5,000 people. They only marry within their own tribe. Their sons and daughters are named after Jewish ancestors: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, Leah. And the women, just like the other account we just read, the women light candles on Friday afternoon and place them under a basket. Dr. Victor Chacon got these out of interviews while he was in the Middle East. He says the elders serve as judges and tribal leaders. You can see that in Deuteronomy 17. Their garments closely resemble the tzitzit that the Jewish priests would wear. Remember the garments that have the tassels at the four corners? They wear these garments with the tassels at the four corners. You can see that in Leviticus 19. Also in Leviticus 19. The males will not shave or square their beard and sideburns. Something else we find from Jewish law. The Pashtuns baked 12 small challah loaves. We're calling the showbread from the temple. They're baked every Friday. They remain fresh until the following Sabbath. You can see that in Leviticus 24 and 1 Chronicles 19. The Pashtun only eat meat slaughtered by other Pashtuns or by kosher Jews. They refuse to eat meat slaughtered by their Shiite neighbors. Kosher kills were the oral law handed down in the Pentateuch by Moses. The Pashtuns also circumcised their babies at 8 days after birth. Deuteronomy 6, you had the Jewish Shema. So Dr. Chacon, we got about 5 minutes here. Dr. Chacon, as he was walking around Afghanistan, he wasn't walking around, he was in a caravan full of his team and several vehicles that were going. These men came out with AK-47s. These are brigands, highway robbers. There were several accounts of these highway robbers. Dr. Chacon ran into them as well. They stopped them, they took their vehicles, they took their equipment, they took their clothes, and they left them out in the desert in their underwear. And so they started walking the next day. They got to the outskirts of a village that they were headed to. These were supposed to be of Hebrew origin. And they came out with AK-47s and tried to take other things. The other things that so they didn't have anything but their underwear left. So so Dr. Chacon is absolutely flabbergasted at this point. He's just over it. And at the top of his lungs, so that the far side of the village, he yells out, "Shema Yisrael." And if you know Deuteronomy 6, "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." Oh, hear Israel, the Lord is our God and the Lord is one. Fascinating. When he did that, these guys with the AK-47 backed away from him. And the leader, reached into his neck and he pulled out a necklace that had the Jewish Shema on it. So this is one of these cases where they wear amulets around their neck bearing the words of Shema Yisrael. They said the Pashtuns, the Panthan tribes, still practice Yibum, which is a Levirate marriage, where if a man marries a woman and then dies, his brother, the Redeemer, will redeem the wife and bear children in his name. Very Jewish. The only civilization ever recorded to have that is in the Torah. So here what we have, really for the first time, is Dr. Jensen was looking at the genetics of this haplogroup cousins of modern-day Israel men. And he begins to look at where 96% of these haplogroup L belongs, or where they're at physically. And you can see them on the map of where they're at. He makes the case that these could be the 10 lost tribes, or they could be the descendants of Esau, who was the brother of Jacob, who was later renamed Israel. He didn't know which. But Dr. Chacon traced these people out, and these are the exact locations where they're at. So I will be finishing up this in December. I'll do my defense in February. I plan to publish this and share it with Dr. Jensen, who's up in Kentucky. By the way, he gave me that Excel spreadsheet that we looked at, and I was able to extract that information and overlay it on this map so that we could see it. But I think there's a direct correlation between those 10 lost tribes that were lost in the biblical narrative, in the biblical text, and what Jeanson has been able to find in the genetics. These people have topographical features that bear Hebrew names. They have family traditions that they're the lost tribes. The villages, the names of the villages that they go by today are the lost tribes of Israel, Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, Ephraim. They still have Jewish traditions. I just ran through a whole list of them: not squaring the beard, circumcision. There are no other cultures in the world that observe circumcision besides the Jews. These people do. And so what we are looking at now are these people that Dr. Chacon found. He documented them very well. There seems to be a direct correlation with this haplogroup L. And so I want to pursue that a little bit further, but I thought that was a pretty neat correlation. When we look at the 6,000-year timeline, what we did is we looked at African trade, and we were able to look at the Y chromosome, go back a couple of hundred years, 200 to 300 years. We could see Africans being moved off of, moving themselves very, very quickly out of the west coast of Africa, moving and fleeing, getting away from conflict, and we see a whole nother group that goes across the Atlantic into North America. What we're doing with that is we're looking at the genetics and comparing it to the ship's manifest and the data that we have to look at the precision of the Y chromosome clock that Jeanson has found. We then have taken that and we overlay that with the 10 lost tribes of Israel. When we start to go back, we've got to remember biblical history, right? So we're actually going to look at the family tree. I'll put a slide into the family tree of the Jews. We can see the Jewish people that we find in the Toledotes, into the genealogies of the Old Testament, and we can trace them out genetically. I'll put a slide in there. It'll blow your mind when you see it. When we look at when this was, 720 BC, when we compare that genetic clock with things that happened in world history, that 6,000-year clock seems to work. Remember what that chart said. That chart that we overlaid with the census data from empires of world history. When we went back to 2400 BC, we were almost at a population of 0, and there were 8 people aboard the ark. But from that point, there's a whole strand of history that they can see in the genetics that goes all the way back to Adam. But the population kind of is the latest common ancestor on the male side would have been that. That I'm making the argument was Noah, this what they call the genetic Adam. Remember, he's different. It's by 100,000 years from the genetic Eve. When you take that 200,000-year paradigm, you squish it down to 6,000 years, we've got a 1,000-year difference between Eve and Noah. The genetic Eve may have been Eve. The genetic Adam might actually be Noah. We can see it in the genetics. It's fascinating. And with that, it's 7 o'clock and we are done for tonight. But we are going to have a lot of information next week. Again, I'll put the slides of the Jewish tribes in there. What Jeanson has found is very compelling and it's fascinating to me that we can see in the genetics, apparently, the exact, almost exactly what we would expect. And I'll explain it next week when we look at it. What questions, comments? Be gentle.
That's good.
Sorry? It's tough to say. So Jimmy's asking what geographic location would he have been? Tough to say. If you ask the Mormons, it was in Utah or something. It's tough to say. I would think it was in that area. When we look at the rivers, so there were the heads of 4 rivers is what they said in Eden. 2 of those were the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. There's been some research on the Thank you. The Pishon River, there is a dry river bed that we can see with satellite imagery today. It generally runs east to west, and it seems to empty out right around where the Jordan is today. It kind of matches up with the Tigris and the Euphrates that come together. This dumps into that basin as well. And then you have the Gihon that they really don't know where it was. I would think that Eden is somewhere in that area if I were to guess, but we really don't know.
So, excusing my lack of history knowledge of that area of the world, is there any inferences of why 18% is in Sri Lanka? That seems very distant, and it's an island. So, have you found any inferences of why it's so high there?
I have not.
'Cause
No,
I
I
don't know
just
the
know
history,
that when he
so.
looks at people today, you got to remember that we're looking at people today and taking their genetics, and that's where a bunch of them have the vast majority, the lion's share. If you take the biggest percentage, that's where they're at, is in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and down in that area. Why they're there, why did they go that far, we don't really know.
Yeah, mine is
sounds-
following up with his, so these interesting Jewish Hebrew names are on the Afghanistan-Pakistani border, right? So Assyria is kind of modern day Iran. They were saying that, hey, you're using us as human shields. So some of them then there may have been other wars where they were then shifted around. So I think it's really interesting what you're saying about Afghan and Pakistan, but like to your point, there's such a huge shift down there. Are they thinking just standard migration? Like what's going on?
There's a picture on the back here. What I did is I took a subset for tonight, just looking at the PACAP border, since that's what I'm most familiar with. I spent 20 years watching that border. I'm familiar with those tribes up in that area. I kind of know the way the Muslims think in that area. This is Japan and Korea, the Asia. So we took a subset. When you look at what Dr. Shakan has found, it goes all the way out to the Far East, to include Sri Lanka and other places. But it's interesting when Jensen, you gonna get that book? You might get that book. He actually traces, one of the things he does is he traces the genetics over linguistic lines. And it's interesting how you can overlay it with geography. For instance, the north part of India, you have the Himalayan mountains. As far as I know, Hannibal was the only one that went over it with elephants, but most people avoid going over mountains unless you've got a mountain pass to go through. You can see in the genetics where these people go around certain features, around lakes, around rivers, around these mountains, but you can trace their lineage. And forced migrations, when people are moving in mass, it's almost like the comet flying around in space. You see this tail where there's things that are kind of coming off of the comet. When people are moving in mass, what you see are these people that are branching off from the main body of the exiles and the main body of people that are moving. They start to move out, and you see really small fractions of these haplogroups that are getting themselves established along the path as they go. And as they go and they end up where they're finally resting, you start to see population increases again. It's really neat the way that he can trace world history, things that we know in world history of mass migrations of people, and being able to trace them genetically. Go.
I don't know if I need to say this to everybody. So the only thing I know about that area is when India and Pakistan split, it was the Muslims, and so that's the only thing I can think of, is that split the way either north and then
Which area are you talking about?
Pakistan and India.
In India?
Yeah, so when it split back in the 40s, right? So that's the only thing
I don't
can
know that
think
they
of.
have split, right? They still
Well,
fighting over
for sure.
Yeah.
But when
that
yeah.
border
Yeah, the border.
The name is eluding me. What is it? No, it's, anyway, there's a whole region up there right along the Pakistani border that they're fighting against, fighting about constantly. One of them is a nuclear power, the other's not. That concerns me.
Well, yeah, makes sense.
What else? So all of this, Scott's asking what's the timeline for this genetic data. 2 Kings 17, we would date to about 721 BC is when they moved out to those river regions, the cities of Medes, Gozan River, Halah, in those areas. What we see again in the Assyrian records is they're putting them along the eastern seaboard. They're complaining that they're using them as a wall. By the way, the Assyrian records also talk about some of them are just walking away. They're walking into those enemy territories and walking east. I would imagine that's where. So you see all the stands that we have today, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all these stands that you have out there in the Middle East. You can start to see from the Y chromosome that it all started in Samaria, the northern tribes of Israel, and goes back from there. And you can see the very small, where they originated, up around Iraq and northern part of modern-day Lebanon, Syria, up in that area. Very, very small fragments because they pulled them out of there and began walking out into the Middle East. It is astounding. So Scott says it's amazing that they still have these traditions. If you understand what the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim conquest was about, again, it was you can pay tithe and you can pay tribute. You could subordinate yourself to us, the Muslims, or you can convert to Islam, or you can be killed. But those are your three choices. Pick one. And what some of these Jews picked was, we'll survive. They had one God. We know the Jews during Roman occupation, rather than them allow Rome to bring Roman emblems into the temple, they would have allowed them to cut their throats first. We know at Masada, we had 900 Jews that went to the top of Masada, and rather than be captured and submit to the to the Romans, they all cut their own throats and all committed suicide up on top of that mountain. They were serious, but they said that they had one God, Allah, and so since they worshiped this one God, they would secretly keep their Hebrew traditions and convert rather than be annihilated. Okay. Yeah, the question was, why do I selectively choose Hebrew instead of Jews? Remember, after Solomon, we branched off into the northern tribe of Israel and the southern tribe of Judah. The 10 northern tribes would have been everything except Judah and Benjamin that were in the kingdom of Judah in the south. The word Jew comes from Judah. That's where the Jews come from. And modern-day Jews that we have today descend from the tribes of Judah, of Benjamin. Remember, Paul said that he was of the tribe of Benjamin. King Saul was the tribe of Benjamin. So we would have had the tribes of Judah, of Benjamin, and a smattering of the Levitical priests from the tribes of Levi that were in the south. The 10 northern tribes were carried off. Technically, they were all Israelite. They were all Hebrew. But they've taken them away, and today we call Jews those that are still there. The people that are in Israel today are Jewish because they all descend from the kingdom of Judah. That's why the distinction. So when they go into the Middle East, those people were not of the tribes of Judah. They were not from the southern kingdom of Judah. Those people in the north were Samaritans that were from the kingdom of Israel and carted off. So we are way over time at this point. Is there anything else? There's one more. I see it.
That's good. I was just going to
You good? Okay. Well, I'll close this out in prayer then. Father, thank you for this time together. We can see your timelines. We can see your hand in things. It's amazing what your design, the information that we have in our genetics and in our DNA, obviously created by a designer, by a creator, Father, and created by you. We're astounded. I'm absolutely amazed by what we have coming. And I hope that we can convey that to everybody so we can have an appreciation for the glory and the power and the majesty of who you are. Father, help me, guide me through these remaining sessions. Father, bring us back next week so we can learn more about your creation. Father, we ask in Jesus' name, amen.